Hello and welcome to our podcast, Bitesize History. I'm Maddie, and today we are kicking off our new civil rights series. In a string of 4 episodes, your hosts Sage, Anna, and I will be discussing and learning about civil rights ranging from the end of the Civil War in 1865 to today in 2020, how we've progressed and where we are now. Today we will be starting out in 1865. The Civil War has just ended, and the nation has now entered the post-Civil War Reconstruction era. African Americans are now free. Congress is dominated by Unionist Republicans, with one Andrew Johnson, a conservative Southerner, as president. Politicians in the North are working towards ways to ensure and secure Black rights, while Southerners are actively working against them in many ways, from social campaigns such as the first uprising of the Ku Klux Klan to creating new states' laws called the Black Codes. The Civil War may be over, African Americans may be considered free, but the fight for rights and respect still goes on across the nation.
Before we get into it, it is important to go over slavery and its relevance in our history. Slavery and bondage has been a cruel economic tool since the beginning of time. Hopping onto this train, colonists brought Africans to the New World through the Middle Passage and started the inhumane practice of slavery in the New World.
For those who don't know, the Middle Passage was a trade route through the Atlantic that was used by colonists from all across Europe to reach the New World. The death rate of slaves who experienced the Middle Passage was 20%. It was a brutal and inhumane method of slave trade.
Colonists used slavery as an economic system to fuel Southern plantations. Despite claims of equality in the Declaration of Independence, slavery survived the Revolution. As the nation entered the 1800s, humanity finally started to prevail as the North and South started to divide on the topic. In short, Northerners were pro-freedom and Southerners were pro-slavery. The abolitionist movement began in the North, which brought about the end to the slave trade in 1807.
As sectionalist conflicts worsened, the South began the Civil War by seceding from the North, which was known as the Union during the Civil War. On January 1, 1863, President Lincoln passed the Emancipation Proclamation, in which he declared that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are and henceforward shall be free.
However, while the end of the Civil War eliminated slavery as an institution, it did not change the mindset of white supremacy for many white Americans. In fact, 1865, the year in which the Civil War ended, also marks the foundation of the Ku Klux Klan.
Many conditions which the Southerners were faced with after the war contributed to the rise of the Klan. Their cities, plantations, and farms were ruined. They were impoverished and often hungry. There was an occupation army in their midst, and Reconstruction governments threatened to usurp the traditional white ruling authority. In the first few months after the fighting ended, white Southerners had to contend with the losses of life, property, and, in their eyes, honor. All these things added up to fuel the fire of hate and widespread sentiment that victimization white Southerners felt from the Black population.
Much of the Klan's early reputation may have been based off of almost frivolous mischief. At first, a favorite Klan tactic had been for a white-sheeted Klansman wearing a mask to ride up to a Black family's home at night and demand water. When the well bucket was offered, the Klansman would gulp it down and demand more, having actually poured the water through a rubber tube that flowed into a leather bottle concealed beneath his robe. After draining several buckets, the rider would exclaim that he had not had a drink since he died on the battlefield at Shiloh. He then galloped into the night, leaving the impression that ghosts of the Confederate dead were riding the countryside.
The presence of armed white men roving the countryside at night reminded many Blacks of pre-war slave patrols. The fact that Klansmen rode with their faces covered intensified Black suspicions and fears. In time, the mischief turned to violence. Whippings were used first, but within months there were bloody clashes between Klansmen and Blacks, Northerners who had come south, or Southern Unionists. From the start, however, there was also a sinister side to the Klan. When rogue Klansmen were at their peak of power, alarmed Northerners justifiably saw the Klan as an attempt of unrepentant Confederates to win through terrorism what they had been unable to win on the battlefield. Such a simple view did not totally explain the Klan's way over the South, but there is little doubt that many a Confederate veteran exchanged his rebel gray hoods for the hoods and sheets of the Invisible Empire.
Racism was not only prevalent among small terrorist and militia groups. State governments in the South began passing laws known as the Black Codes, constructed to restrict African American rights politically and economically. The black codes almost mirrored the slave codes, including laws that enforced a strict curfew, restricted interracial marriage, prevented meetings of more than 10 colored people without supervision from a white person, and restricted African American rights to carry a weapon of any kind, among many other regulations. The punishment for breaking these laws in any degree was either extremely steep fines or manual labor for weeks on the railroads.
Black codes were enforced in order to keep the freed African Americans stuck in their inferior social status and to secure an inexpensive source of labor. The same effect was also reached through a new labor system known as sharecropping. Sharecropping was an economic arrangement under which a landless person contracted with a landowner to work a piece of land. The landowner provided the sharecropper with food, seeds, and fertilizer. In return, the landowner would receive a share of the crop, usually 50%.
So basically what she's saying is this was slavery but with another name.
However, not all events that occurred during Reconstruction consisted of corrupt and hypocritical systems that would haunt Americans throughout the rest of history. While the South was passing restrictive and racist laws, Congress passed the 14th Amendment in 1868. This amendment gave the right to citizenship to all natural-born residents regardless of color.
The amendment also prevented states from passing right-restrictive laws. This means that the black codes were legally null and void. This didn't stop illegal discrimination and racism, though.
A really interesting part of this amendment is the way it was passed into law. As you can imagine, the South wasn't interested in the 14th Amendment at all. To counteract this, Congress passed the Military Reconstruction Act of 1867 to give Southern states a little push in the right direction. The act stated that to be readmitted into the Union, the state needed to elect both blacks and whites to a state convention in order to write a new constitution that allowed African Americans to vote. This new constitution would need to be ratified and approved by Congress. Then, once all this was complete, the states would need to ratify the 14th Amendment with their new body of voters, and that was their ticket to being readmitted to the Union.
Also, it's important to note that African Americans didn't simply sit back and let their oppression continue. It's important to remember blacks did rise up. For example, organizations like the Equal Rights League, which held state and local conventions to protest discriminatory treatment and oppose oppressive Reconstruction policies, and the Union League, which encouraged the political activism of African Americans, spread through the South. During the state constitutional conventions held in 1867 through 1869, blacks and white Americans stood side by side for the first time in political life.
Moving forward into 1870, KKK activity was getting really bad. Officials in law were recruited as Klansmen, and it was hard to find anyone, even if they weren't part of the Klan, to testify against Klan members. The KKK inspired fear among everyone and controlled the South. At this point, Southern governments turned to Congress for help. In response, 3 enforcement acts were passed. The most important and effective of the 3 was the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. This act turned designated crimes of KKK members into federal offenses. An example is conspiracy to deprive someone of their right to hold office. The act included the power to the president to suspend the writ of habeas corpus and arrest accused individuals without charge, and also to send military forces to put a stop to Klan violence.
However, in 1896, the Supreme Court made one of its most racist and corrupt decisions with Plessy v. Ferguson. The court's ruling in 1896, separate but equal, was now the law of the land. This meant that businesses and schools were allowed to legally discriminate against colored people and deny service to them.
Another tactic used by segregationists in the North was called redlining. Redlining was the practice of denying loans, mortgages, etc. to minorities to discourage them from living in certain areas. Unfortunately, this was prominent in almost every major city in the U.S.
The practice of redlining was enabled by various Supreme Court decisions that were established in 1875. The Supreme Court consolidated 5 cases into one ruling declaring the Civil Rights Act unconstitutional. This would spur Jim Crow laws and effectively bar Congress from fixing racial segregation. Despite the many other corrupt and oppressive laws, Plessy v. Ferguson marks the point in history in which slavery evolved into segregation. This led to increased resistance and African Americans continuing to fight for their equality, which we will discuss in the next episode of Bitesize History. Thank you for listening to our podcast on Bitesize History. Tune in for episode 2 of our Civil Rights series.